Daf Yomi, Tractate Menachot, page 90. Page 90a. And starting at the bottom of 89b, just for context, to get it started, the Gemara deflects the objection, yes, indeed, it is indeed so that Rabbi Yochanan's ruling should be extended to other cases, as Rav Menachot bar Gada claimed. Rather, Abaye said, Rabbi Yochanan mentioned just one of them as an example, even though they're all correct. Rabbi Abba said that there is a different resolution. Actually, Rabbi Yochanan's ruling is limited to a guilt offering of a leper. The other offerings that Rav Menachot bar Gada mentioned would be valid even if the additional conditions that originally applied to them were not fulfilled. The reason for this is as follows. Granted, these other offerings that Rav Menachot bar Gada mentioned would be valid as they are burnt offerings. And now we are on top of 90a with the words Ilo Chazu Leolat Chova. Okay? Ilo Chazu Leolat Chova Krovi lo ilas nidove Elahacha Ilo Mok Misle Bemilse Asham Nidawa Miika. Therefore, even if they are no longer fit to be sacrificed as obligatory burnt offerings for which they were originally consecrated, having now been slaughtered, not for their own sake, they can still be sacrificed as voluntary burnt offerings without the need to fulfill the additional conditions that originally applied to them. But here, with regard to the guilt offering of a leper, if you do not maintain it in accordance with its original status and require it to be brought together with its libations, it can no longer be considered a guilt offering at all, as is there a voluntary guilt offering. Tanik was it Rabbi Yochanan, Osh Mitzoire, Shishchate b'sheloi lishmoi, Oy sheloi nosa midamoy el gabe behoinois, Hareizo oilo legabe mizbeach, Viton sochim, Vitzorech oshomacha leatiroi. The Gemara notes that it is taught in the Braita in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. In the case of a guilt offering of a leper that one slaughtered not for its own sake, or in a case where one did not place some of its blood upon the leper's right thumb or big toe, this guilt offering is still brought up upon the altar and requires libations, meaning a meal offering and wine libation. But since it was sacrificed incorrectly, the leper needs to bring another guilt offering to permit him to partake of offerings. Okay? That's the Talmud Nu Mishnah. Nu Mishnah. Zog de Mishnah. Kol midos shebe mikdash. Hayu nigdashos. Chutz mishel koyin gadol shehoyed godishon letoicha. All measuring vessels that were in the temple were such that they held the volume that they measured when their contents were heaped up above the rim, except for the measuring vessel used to measure the flour for the griddle cake offering of the high priest, as its heaped measure, meaning the quantity of flour held by a tenth of an ephah. Measuring vessel, when heaped, was contained within its walls when the flour was leveled with the rim. This was due to the fact that the measuring vessel for the griddle cake offering was slightly larger than the 10th of an ephah measuring vessel. Midot halach berutzehen koidesh umidos hayavesh berutzein chol. With regard to measuring vessels for liquids, their overflows, meaning that which flows onto the outside of vessels' walls, are sacred, but with regard to measuring vessels for dry substances, their overflows are non-sacred. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Midos halach koidesh, lefichach merutzeim koidesh. Midos ayavesh chol, lefichach merutzein chol. Rabbi Yossi Omer, lo mishum ze ela shalach ne'ekal, yavesh eno ne'ekal. Rabbi Akiva says that the reason for this difference is that since the measuring vessels for liquids are themselves sacred, therefore their overflows are sacred. And since the measuring vessels for dry substances are non-sacred, therefore their overflows are non-sacred. Rabbi Yossi says the difference is not due to that factor. Rather, it is because the overflow of liquid was originally inside the vessel where it became consecrated and was then displaced. Whereas the overflow of a dry substance was not displaced from inside the vessel, so it had not become consecrated. That's the Mishnah. Now for the Gemara. The Gemara says, Mani, Rabbi Meir Chad Gadush Hava Yirabanan Chad Machuk Hava. The Mishnah and Gemara on 87a cite a dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Meir concerning the number and nature of the measuring vessels used for dry substances. In light of that dispute, the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion is the Mishnah here? If you suggest it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, that is difficult. He holds that there were two measuring vessels that held a 10th of an ephah, but only one of them was such that it held its measure when heaped. The other one held its measure when leveled. And if you suggest it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, that is difficult. They hold there was only one measuring vessel that held a 10th of an ephah, and it held its measure when leveled. How can the Mishnah state that all measuring vessels in the temple were heaped? Amar Rav Chizda le'olam Rabbi Meir umay kol midos kol medidos. Rav Chizda said, actually, the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, that only one of two measuring vessels that held a 10th of an ephah was such that it held its measure when heaped. And what does the Mishnah mean when it says all measuring vessels in the temple were heaped? It means that all measurements performed with that measuring vessel were done when its contents were heaped above its rim. That it means that all measurements performed with that measuring vessel were done when its contents were heaped above its rim. Okay? Midot halach berutzehen kodesh b'may kamiflegim. The Mishnah discusses the status of overflows. The first Tana states simply that with regard to measuring vessels for liquids, their overflows are sacred. But with regard to measuring vessels for dry substances, their overflows are non-sacred. Rabbi Akiva explains that this distinction is a function of whether the measuring vessel is itself sacred. Rabbi Yossi explains it is function of whether the overflow had initially been inside the vessel. The Gemara asks, with regard to what matter do these three Tanaim disagree? Tana kama sofer midas halach nimshicha bein mibifnim bein mibachutz midas yovesh nimshicha mibifnim v'lo nimshicha mibachutz. The Gemara explains the first Tana holds that the measuring vessels for liquid items, for example, wine for libations and oil, were anointed and thereby consecrated both on the inside and on the outside. Therefore, the overflow is consecrated as it comes in contact with the outside of the vessel's walls. The measuring vessels for dry items, such as the flour for meal offerings, were anointed and consecrated only on the inside, but were not anointed on the outside. Therefore, the overflow is not consecrated when it comes into contact with the outside of the vessel's walls. Rabbi Akiva Sofer midas halach nimshicha bein mibifnim bein bachutz midas yovesh lo nimshicha kol iko. And Rabbi Akiva, who states the difference is due to whether the vessel is sacred or non-sacred, holds that the measuring vessels for liquid items were anointed on the inside and were not anointed on the outside, whereas the measuring vessels for dry items were not anointed at all. They remained non-sacred and so could not consecrate the overflow. Rabbi Yossi Sofer idivin nimsham mifnim v'lo nimshicha mibachutz yochahainu taime dilach nekam nigava dimona kasi v'ayovesh eno ne'ekor. And Rabbi Yossi holds that this and that, meaning both types of measuring vessels, were anointed only on the inside, but were not anointed on the outside. So to here, this is the reason behind whether the overflow was sacred, as the overflow of liquid was originally inside the vessel and was then displaced, and it comes from inside of the vessel. It is therefore consecrated, but the overflow of the dry substance was not originally inside the vessel and then displaced, and so it was never consecrated. The Gemara questions this explanation of Rabbi Yossi's opinion, where even if the overflow was previously inside the vessel and then displaced, what of it? A person intends to consecrate only that which he requires, and even so, if the overflow had been inside the vessel, it would not have been consecrated. Amar Rav Dimi ba shishna mishmei derav zoi meres klei shores mikachin shloi midas. Ravino Amar le'oilam ein malach klei shores ein mikachin el midas gzera shemo yoim rubetzien nichli shores lecho. Rav Dimi bar Shishna said in the name of Rav, this is to say that the service vessels consecrate their contents even without the intent of the person using them. Venus said, actually, I will say to you that the service vessels consecrate their contents only with the intent of the person using them. And the Torah law And by Torah law, the overflows are not sacred. But the sages issued a decree to regard them as sacred, lest people say that one may transfer a substance that has been consecrated in a service vessel to non-sacred status. Moisiv Rab Zeira Sideres Halechem V'yasabuzichin Lachar Shabbos Yiktires Abuzichin Shabbos Psula Ketzad Yaseh Yanichenu L'Shabbos Haboo Shafilu Hu Al Shulchan Yomim Rabim Ein B'kach Plu. Rabbi Zera raised an objection to this explanation from a Mishnah on 100a. Each Shabbat, new showbread and bowls of frankincense were arranged on the table in the sanctuary. They remained there until the following Shabbat, at which point the frankincense was burned, thereby permitting the showbread to be eaten. If the priests arranged the bread and the bowls of frankincense on the table after Shabbat during the week, and then he burned the frankincense in the bowls on the Shabbat at the end of the week, the bread is disqualified, as it had not been on the table for a full 7 days from one Shabbat to the next. How then should one proceed to prevent the disqualification? He should leave the bread on the table until the following Shabbat, as even if it remained on the table for many days, there is nothing wrong with that, provided that it is there for at least 7 days. The frankincense may then be burned, and it will permit the bread to be eaten. Ve'emahasam. Hold on. Ve'amai. But why? Hasam nami lema gzero shema. Yolma mafkidin michlei shoreis. Rabbi Zera explains his objection. But why is it permitted to leave the bread on the table for more than 7 days? There too, let us say that the sages issued a decree disqualifying the bread, lest people say that one can store sacred items in a service vessel overnight, and that will prevent them from becoming disqualified. Evidently, the sages did not issue such decrees, and it follows that also, with regard to using measuring vessels, they did not issue a decree. Panim achutz kol ramiz. Pinim lav kol yam yadi chutz kol yam yadi. The Gemara rejects this claim. Are you raising a contradiction between a rite performed inside the sanctuary, meaning the arrangement of the showbread, and a rite performed outside the sanctuary, meaning using the measuring vessel? Since in the case of a rite performed inside the sanctuary, not everyone is aware of what is happening. There's no concern that all people will misinterpret what is going on, and so there's no need to issue a decree concerning it. In the case of a rite performed outside the sanctuary, everyone is aware of what is happening, and there is no need to issue a decree to prevent people from drawing mistaken conclusions. It's not awesome. The Gemara continues to discuss the overflow of measures. We learn in the Mishnah there, in Shkalim 10b, that surplus libations were sold, and the proceeds used to purchase supplementary offerings on the altar. My moisel nisochim. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of surplus libations? Rabbi Chia bar Yosef amar berutze midois. Rabbi Yochanan amar keoiso sheshoninu. Mikabel lisapek selosois me'arba v'yamdu b'shaloish. Yisapek me'arba. Rabbi Chia bar Yosef says it means the overflows of measuring vessels. Rabbi Yochanan says surplus libations are like that which we learned in another Mishnah, in Shkalim 13a, in the case of one who accepts upon himself to supply fine flour at 4 se'ah for a selah, and its market price stood at 3 se'ah. For a selah, he is required to fulfill his commitment and supply fine flour at 4 se'ah for a selah. Okay, we'll stop here.